"Hey Mom, we're moving in with you. If you don't like it, we won't see you ever again, and we won't take care of you in your old age either. You don't have a problem with that, do you?" My son's sudden declaration shocked me so much that my voice trembled. To make such an important decision and tell me like it was a routine work report. The coldness in his voice made my chest ache, and it was hard to breathe. My husband had passed away, and my son was the only person I could rely on. I could hear my son's, Ken's, overbearing voice through the phone. On the other end of the line, I could hear his wife, Mary, say, "You're living alone anyway, so it should be fine," with a hint of mockery. Her tone suggested that it was only natural for me to give up my house since I was an old woman living alone. There was not a shred of consideration for me in her voice. They were even threatening that I might never see them again. Why were they pushing me this far? I understand. A deep, long sigh naturally escaped me. I wanted to calm down and think about this sudden turn of events, but I wasn't even allowed to do that. Why couldn't I live with my son and his wife in this house filled with memories of my husband? The phone was abruptly hung up. Silence filled the room. I glanced at my husband's photo. If I had been stricter with Ken, would he have turned out to be such a selfish adult? This regret swirled heavily in my chest. Outside the window, the moonlight dimly illuminated the garden. The shadows of the trees my husband and I had planted together swayed sadly. Suddenly, I remembered my daughter-in-law's usual behavior. She likes a flashy lifestyle, not caring about what the neighbors might think. The other day, when she came to visit, she left most of the modest meal I prepared, saying, "I can't eat this." Her arrogant lifestyle was about to be brought into this house. What kind of treatment would I receive in this house from now on? This premonition sent a chill down my spine. And so it began. My name is Carol Miller, and I'm 68 years old. I lived with my architect husband and our only son. My architect husband, Brian, was renowned not only in America but also internationally for his exceptional architectural skills, and he was reputed to create eternal beauty that transcends time. As a budding journalist and photographer for an architectural magazine, I became captivated by Brian's architectural creations. I had originally aspired to become an architect myself, but due to family circumstances, I had to give up that dream. I wanted to stay connected to the world of architecture, which I loved so much, so I worked as a journalist and photographer. After witnessing the magnificence of Brian's work, I longed to meet him someday. A few years later, it was decided that Brian's work would be featured in my magazine. I immediately volunteered to be in charge. My first impression of him was that he was much calmer than his age suggested. He looked me straight in the eye and asked, "It's a big camera. Isn't it heavy for you?" I fell completely in love with him at that moment. My face turned bright red and all I could do was nod. The photo shoot and interview went smoothly, but I was so nervous that I couldn't ask half the questions I had prepared. After Brian and his team left, I was in tears in the studio wondering what to do. Just then, Brian returned, saying he had forgotten something, and he saw me crying. When I explained the situation, he said, "Let's have dinner together sometime, just the two of us." And we ended up going on a date. From then on, for 40 years, we started dating, got married, had a child, our only son Ken, and made many memories together. However, 2 years ago, Brian passed away from an illness. On his sickbed, Brian said to me, "Carol, I'm leaving the house in Beverly Hills in your name. It's the first and last masterpiece I made for the person I love. That house is your castle. Please think of it as me and take good care of it." At the time, I was more focused on wanting him to get better and live with me, so I didn't think much of it. But when I actually went through the inheritance process, I found that the house had been in my name since it was built. I realized that I had been relying on Brian's kindness from beginning to end, and I couldn't stop crying. I decided to cherish the Beverly Hills house just as Brian had told me to. Mrs. Miller, the Beverly Hills house that your husband, Mr. Miller, left behind has appreciated considerably in value. The land value has increased and Mr. Miller's popularity remains strong, so the building itself also holds significant value. Mr. Wilson, the sales manager at Trust Realty, said this to me. He comes to check on me every month. Brian worked as an architectural advisor for Mr. Wilson's company. The two of them worked together to grow Trust Realty. They had been best friends since their college days for almost 30 years. Our families were like one big family. However, 5 years ago, Mr. Wilson's wife fell victim to a real estate scam and was defrauded of a large sum of money. The scheme was so elaborate that by the time Mr. Wilson realized what was happening, the money had already been paid. They consulted the police, of course, but the culprit's trail went cold, and the money was never recovered. His wife blamed herself and took her own life. Mr. Wilson himself was devastated by the incident, but he eventually regained his composure. He declared that he would dedicate his life to preventing real estate scams targeting the elderly. Alongside his work, he has been visiting elderly homeowners in my area to offer advice and support. Just the other day, there was another real estate scam in the city. They fabricated a non-existent owner and tried to force a land contract. So Mrs. Miller, please be careful not to let anyone into your house who comes offering to buy it at a high price. Mr. Wilson repeatedly warned me before leaving. Honestly, since I've been living in this house, countless real estate agents have come by asking me to sell the land. No matter how many times I refuse, they keep coming back, persistently trying to make a deal about the land. But I can never let go of this house. This house, where I've lived for 30 years, is filled with memories. I maintain the house and garden every day, so it doesn't feel old at all. My neighbors are all wonderful people. We always look out for each other. In particular, my neighbor Mrs. Taylor's daughter-in-law Sarah is young, but we get along very well. She's good with social media. When I'm tending the garden, she shows me online articles about plants. She's also part of a local social media community where people share information. Mrs. Miller, it looks like a new supermarket is opening nearby. She always gives me useful information like that. Sometimes I think it might be a bit too big for one person to live in, but my son, Ken, works for a major tech company in the city. I secretly dream of holding my grandchild on the sunny porch of this house someday when he comes to visit with his family. However, my son and his wife are busy and rarely come to visit. I hope they'll come during the 4th of July or Christmas holidays. I always prepare for their visit just in case. But his wife, Mary, also works for a foreign financial company, and she's apparently very busy. Sometimes I feel lonely, but when I think about the freedom of living alone without being tied to anyone's schedule, I feel a little brighter. One Sunday afternoon, while I was relaxing and tending to my garden, the intercom rang. It's unusual to have visitors on a Sunday afternoon. Even salespeople don't usually come on Sundays. Muttering to myself, I opened the front door. Ken and Mary were standing there. It was unusual for them to visit without calling first. They didn't even come last New Year's, saying they were too busy. What's going on? Welcome! What's the occasion, you two? I asked, a bit bewildered. We were in the neighborhood, so we thought we'd stop by and see how you were doing. I suddenly had a craving for your cooking, Mom. Ken smiled. Seeing his face made me smile too. Oh, really? Well, I'm sorry. I was just surprised because it was so sudden. Come on in. I ushered them into the living room and started preparing an early dinner. I made Ken's favorite dish, Salisbury steak. Delicious! Your cooking is the best, Mom. Better than any restaurant. He had a happy smile on his face. Mary, sitting next to him, also praised the food with wide eyes. Your cooking is really delicious, Mrs. Miller. I'm not very good at making this kind of home-style food. I felt warm and happy to have a family dinner after such a long time. After that, Ken and Mary started visiting often on Sunday afternoons. I enjoyed preparing food for them, anticipating their visits. I varied the menu each week, sometimes American, sometimes Italian, sometimes Chinese, and felt happy seeing their pleased faces. 2 months passed with these enjoyable weekends. One day, after we finished dinner as usual, I went to the kitchen to make tea. When I returned, I saw that they had spread out an unfamiliar envelope on the table. Hey, Mom, we actually have a proposal for you today. We brought some documents. Can you take a look? A proposal? I didn't understand what Ken meant by proposal. I opened the envelope he handed me. Inside were brochures for a retirement home. My mind went blank when I saw the words retirement home, something I had never even considered. Ken and I have been discussing your future, Mom, and we're worried about you living alone. This retirement home allows frequent visits, and they have lots of events so you can make many friends. How about we go and take a look? Retirement home? I'm still doing well, and I have no intention of leaving this house. It's often said that a house quickly deteriorates when no one lives in it, a saying Brian often repeated. Thank you for your concern, but I'm still healthy and have no intention of leaving this house, I said firmly, looking them both in the eye. Ken and Mary exchanged troubled glances. Then how about we move in here? It must be hard for you to manage this big house alone, Mom. This way we can have dinner together like this every day. I was perplexed by their offer. First, they suggested a retirement home, and when I refused, they proposed moving in. I had no idea what they were really after. Also, just so we have an idea of the monthly expenses for the retirement home, could you show us your bank book? Ken's eyes were intense, and he had a slight smile on his lips. He seemed like a different person from before. Mary also had a strange smile on her face. An unsettling atmosphere filled the room, making it hard to breathe. I'm going to the restroom for a minute. I excused myself. I overheard their conversation from the hallway. I heard them talking about needing to hurry up and settle this and getting the money. They also mentioned something about needing to kick her out. What on earth were they talking about? After a while, I heard the sound of a camera shutter clicking repeatedly from inside the room. Surprised, I opened the door. They were taking pictures of the room. Hey, what are you doing? I stood there, stunned. Oh, we thought we'd, keep some memories, you know. We'll take some of the other rooms, too. They looked flustered, but continued taking pictures of the house. Wait a minute, stop it. Please leave for today. Perplexed, I asked them to leave. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Until now, we had always enjoyed a relaxing time after dinner. I felt a sense of dread towards my son and his wife, who had suddenly changed. Money, bank book, retirement home. These unexpected topics left me feeling confused. The next day, something even more surprising happened. While I was tending to my garden, my neighbor, Mrs. Taylor, came over with a worried look on her face. Mrs. Miller, this was posted on my social media community page. Is this your house by any chance? She showed me a URL. When I opened it, I saw a social media account called Mary's Life of Luxury. There were pictures of the exterior of my house and part of the living room. The caption shocked me even more. It read, "Lovely house. It will be ours someday. Hashtag Beverly Hills, hashtag Malibu." Mary. Could it be Mary's social media? The more I scrolled through her past photos, the more certain I became. There was a post that said, "A gift from Brian, who's a manager at a major tech company," with a picture of a designer accessory. There were also pictures of expensive handbags and designer clothes. Even though she worked for a foreign financial company, her lavish spending was concerning. It's tagged Beverly Hills, so someone in the community found it. It seems like your daughter-in-law is living quite a lavish lifestyle. I was a bit worried. I'm sorry if I'm overstepping. I thanked Mrs. Taylor for her concern and quickly went back inside. I was increasingly filled with unease. I spent the next few days with a heavy heart. On the weekend, Ken and Mary came to visit again. As we were having dinner, a real estate agent suddenly showed up, which was unusual. When I stood up to answer the door, Ken and Mary started acting strangely flustered. A real estate agent? Why? Did Mom call them? It's unusual for them to come on a holiday. They were acting very nervous. No, I think it's just a door-to-door salesperson. I answered the door and came back. Mom, you don't need to deal with those real estate agents anymore. It's just a waste of time. Anyway, look at this. Ken handed me some documents about inheritance tax strategies. Do you know about Intervivo's gift? It's more beneficial to transfer assets sooner rather than later. So how about transferring the ownership of this house to me soon? Ken made another new proposal. My heart was racing. I couldn't hide my unease. I remained silent. Ken and Mary, perhaps growing impatient with my silence, started pressing me. Mom, inheritance tax can be incredibly high. It's common these days to transfer assets early and enjoy a comfortable retirement. If it reduces your burden, we'd be happy too. They started to push the issue of changing the ownership of the house. Wait a minute. I have no intention of selling this house. I desperately tried to convey my feelings, but they didn't seem to care about my wishes. Anyway, just read through these documents. It's not a bad deal for you, Mom. They said and left. What used to be enjoyable weekend dinners were gradually turning into a source of stress for me. After Ken and Mary left, their incomprehensible behavior left a lingering unease in my heart. Are they really after this house? Such unpleasant thoughts kept surfacing and disappearing. To calm myself down, I started tending to my garden. Brian had created this spacious garden for me, knowing how much I loved plants. Taking care of the flowers was my solace. Watering the plants and removing dead leaves helped to soothe my mind. Hello, Mrs. Miller. Your garden is beautiful as always. Mr. Wilson, who came for his regular visit, greeted me with a smile. Mr. Wilson, hello. Tending to the garden helps me relax, but lately I haven't been able to keep up with the lawn maintenance. I was thinking that maybe if I replaced it with gravel and placed some stone lanterns, it would match the aesthetic of the house better. I see. Indeed, if the lawn isn't properly maintained, it can detract from the overall look. And it will be quite a lot of work to keep looking after it. So how about a remodel? I can certainly help you with that, he suggested. My heart leaped at the thought of my wishes becoming a reality. I asked him to prepare an estimate. A few days later, Mr. Wilson came to visit with the garden renovation plans and the estimate. I was overjoyed at the thought of the garden, a place filled with memories of Brian becoming even more beautiful. Thank you. This plan is perfect. Please proceed with it. Understood. I'm sure it will become an even more wonderful garden. By the way, how have you been lately? I've heard that real estate agents have been coming around more often. I hesitated for a moment, but I decided to tell Mr. Wilson about Ken and Mary's recent behavior. I wanted his objective opinion. After hearing my story, Mr. Wilson's expression turned serious. He thought for a moment and then spoke. Mrs. Miller, it's hard to say this, but it sounds like your son and his wife are trying to take over your house. If you like, I can look into them for you. Mr. Wilson's urgent tone made me realize the gravity of the situation. Could you? I'm at a loss every time they come over each weekend with their strange behavior, but I haven't had the courage to confront them directly. Of course, it might take some time, but I'd like to do what I can to help ensure your peace of mind. Tears welled up in my eyes at Mr. Wilson's kind words. The garden renovation and the investigation into Ken and Mary proceeded simultaneously. A few months later, Mr. Wilson came to visit, saying that he had finally obtained the investigation results. According to the investigation, your son has a debt of $200,000. He started trading stocks but suffered significant losses. He then tried to recover that money through online gambling, which only made his debt grow. No way. He climbed all the way to a managerial position in the sales department of such a big company, so I assumed he was living a stable life. I can't believe he has $200,000 in debt. I was shocked. Mr. Wilson continued, and that's not all. Your son and his wife live in a luxury apartment, but their monthly loan payment is $10,000. They've completely stopped making payments. In addition, they've recently contacted multiple real estate agents trying to sell this house. I was speechless. They were trying to sell this house without my permission. But Mr. Wilson, Ken knows how much Brian cherished this house. I don't think he would do such a thing just because he has debts. I said reflexively, a debt of $200,000 is something that a couple can manage to repay if they work together. They both work for large companies and earn more than the average person. However, your daughter-in-law seems to have extravagant spending habits, and about 1/3 of the debt is hers. No matter how much they work, it seems they are nowhere near paying off their loans and debts. Judging from Mr. Wilson's expression, Ken and Mary's financial situation must have been quite dire. The reason they were pressing me to change the ownership was probably that they wanted to sell this house quickly and get their hands on some money. I looked at a picture of young Ken displayed on the wall. When did Ken change so much? As I thought about it, tears started to fall. I know how painful this must be for you, Mrs. Miller. However, your son and daughter-in-law are already at an advanced stage with the real estate agents. There's no time to lose. If we don't act now, this house will be taken over and sold. So I have a proposal. Mr. Wilson's proposal was this. A close acquaintance of his, a businessman named Mr. Brown, was a big fan of Brian's architecture and had always wanted this house. However, Mr. Wilson knew how much I cherished this house and had always refused. Mr. Brown agreed, saying that if I ever wanted to sell, he would be the first to make an offer. If a real estate agent who comes to the door gets their hands on the house, it will likely be demolished immediately. It's in a location where a commercial building would be built. Mr. Wilson suggested that selling it to Mr. Brown, who would preserve the house, was the best option. The garden renovation was nearing completion. I asked Mr. Wilson to give me some time to think until the work was finished. During that time, Ken and Mary continued to visit every weekend. They tried to look into Brian's study and asked for the combination to the safe. My heart was wary. I decided to sell the house to Mr. Brown and informed Mr. Wilson of my decision. I see. Understood. I will proceed with the paperwork on my end. I'm sure you'll be busy with the move, so please contact me if you need anything. I entrusted all the procedures for the new apartment and the sale of the house to Mr. Wilson. I started to organize the house. I didn't have much stuff to begin with, so the house quickly became empty. Mr. Brown kindly offered to let me leave behind any furniture I didn't need for the new place. I polished the furniture, each piece filled with memories, while thanking them. These were carefully selected by Brian, mostly imported from abroad. Some pieces had historical value. I was unsure what to do, but they wouldn't suit the new apartment. These pieces of furniture shown because they were in this house. I couldn't bring myself to take them with me. Meanwhile, I received a call from Ken. "Oh, Mom, we're moving in 3 days. I talked to Mary and we decided to take care of you. If you don't like it, we won't bother with you ever again. That includes any caregiving in your old age. Keep that in mind." The call ended. I was terrified by Ken's threatening tone. I trembled for a while. Unfortunately, after Brian passed away, I had given Ken a spare key just in case. Even if I used a sitter in 3 days, he would still be able to enter with the spare key. I never imagined that the spare key I gave him would become a threat. I didn't know what to do, so I called Mr. Wilson. "Mrs. Miller, this is a serious crime. To ensure your safety, let's first have the movers come earlier and get you moved to your new place. On paper, the owner is now Mr. Brown, so I'll put up a sold sign as well. I think that will make your son give up," he advised. I immediately contacted the movers and completed the move. On the promised day, Ken and Mary arrived with 2 large moving trucks. Ken got out of a taxi holding a bottle of celebratory wine and headed for the entrance, clearly drunk. What the hell is this? Ken's eyes fell on the large sold sign posted on the gate. "Don't mess with me. What's going on?" he yelled and entered the house using the spare key. Mrs. Taylor, my neighbor, saw the whole thing and contacted me. I was resting at my new place, but I rushed back to the house. The door was wide open and I could hear loud noises from inside. I hurried in. The furniture I had left behind was smashed to pieces. As I went further inside, I reached the sun porch. The scene before me took my breath away. The flowers I had grown and the stone lanterns I had just installed were in a terrible state. Nearby, Ken was picking and breaking the plants. "This house is mine. I don't need this garden," he was yelling. He ripped apart my photo album with Brian and stomped on the scattered photos. I stood there stunned. Ken had pulled out and trampled on all the flowers in the garden that I had lovingly tended to for 30 years. Anger and sadness welled up inside me, and I couldn't stop shaking. Next to Ken, Mary was laughing and throwing pots from high up, smashing them. They were both clearly drunk, staggering around the garden and yelling. Probably because neighbors had reported them, the police soon arrived and apprehended Ken and Mary. The 2 were arrested on the spot. Their arms were restrained as they were led to the police car. On the way, Ken met my eyes and suddenly fell to his knees. "Mom, I'm sorry. I did a terrible thing in a moment of weakness. Please forgive me. If you drop the charges, we'll be released. Please," he pleaded, tears and snot running down his face. Mary, with her bag hanging off her shoulder, her makeup ruined, and her hair disheveled, also spoke. "Mrs. Miller, please tell the police not to take us away. We'll pay for the damages." The 2 of them sat on the ground, and even the police officers seemed perplexed. "As you can probably see from the sign at the entrance, this house has been sold. I'm no longer the owner," I declared. Then Mr. Brown, the new owner who had received a call from the police, appeared from behind me. "I bought this house. You must be Ken, Mrs. Miller's son. You've done a terrible thing. Breaking and entering, property damage, and even threats. I've heard everything. Did you think you would get away with it just because you're family?" He directed a look of contempt at Ken and Mary. "Oh, so you're the one who tricked my mom and stole this house. Don't screw with me. I'm supposed to inherit this house. I have plans with a real estate developer to build a big commercial building here. What gives you the right to interfere?" Ken's anger was directed at Mr. Brown, but with his arms held tightly by the strong police officers, he didn't have the usual intimidating presence. I looked around at the destroyed garden and the state of the house again and sighed. "Ken, you have no right to inherit this house. Our relationship as mother and son is over," I said coldly. Ken and Mary looked at me with wide eyes. Despair was evident in their eyes. I had cast aside all my love and affection for them. I watched them being taken away with a resolute expression. The 2, with their shoulders slumped, were placed in the police car and taken to the police station. A crowd of neighbors had gathered, silently watching the scene. Thanks to Mr. Brown's daily pleas, it was decided that no charges would be filed. I repeatedly apologized for the trouble caused. "It's not your fault, Mrs. Miller, but it's sad to see Mr. Miller's masterpiece, this house, in such a state. In the garden. You did such a beautiful job with the renovation. They were intoxicated, so I hope something like this never happens again," he said. I apologized to Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Taylor and thanked them. They both told me not to worry about it and were more concerned about me instead. I was surrounded by truly wonderful people. This was all thanks to the connections Brian had left behind. I put my hands together in prayer at the altar I had brought to my new home. I was thankful. What would Ken and Mary do now? According to Mr. Wilson, they had already moved out of their luxury apartment. They were fully intending to move into my house. But now that my house was sold, they had nowhere to live. I did feel a bit worried, but Ken was an adult now. There was no need for me to extend any more help. I started a peaceful life in my new apartment. However, Ken and Mary hadn't given up their obsession with me. They were searching for my new address. I was unaware of this and went about my daily life. One day while I was at a nearby supermarket, Mary spotted me by chance. She followed me and found out where I lived. That night, they showed up at my apartment. The intercom rang, and when I checked the monitor, I saw Ken and Mary. They were banging on the door violently. "Mom, come out. We won't leave until you come out. Because of you, we've lost our place to live." They were yelling loudly. I was terrified and accidentally opened the door. Ken and Mary glared at me. They stood in the doorway with cold expressions and not a word of apology between them. Mom, I'm not going to play the nice son anymore, Ken said, taking out a contract. I was handed the document, but couldn't understand it well. When I remained silent, Mary spoke up. Look at this. It's a contract with your seal, made 2 years ago. It was a document to change the house's name. 2 years ago, right after Dad died, you transferred the ownership of the house to Ken, Mom. Did you forget? So for you to sell the house without his permission is illegal. I had no memory of changing the name. But this contract had my name and the official seal that had been kept in Brian's study. There was no mistaking it. Why was this here? I don't remember doing any of this. Where did you get this? Oh, come on, Mom. Are you really forgetting? Or are you just pretending? We took this from Dad's study. Of course, since it is a contract with Ken, we have the right to do whatever we want, right? That means you are a criminal who sold Ken's property without his permission. I was shocked by the word criminal. I couldn't believe it. I don't know anything about this contract. My head was spinning, and tears welled up in my eyes. Well, anyway, give us all the money you got from selling the house to that Mr. Brown guy. If you do that, we'll let you off the hook for now. The two of them slowly closed in on me. Just then, a neighbor, concerned by the noise, came to check on me. Is everything all right? They asked. Ken and Mary seemed to have lost their nerve. Yeah, that's the deal. We'll come back tomorrow, so think about it. They left with a smirk. From that day on, they frequently came to my apartment demanding the money from the sale of the house. In addition to that, on Mary's social media, she portrayed me as a cruel mother-in-law who sued her own family. She wrote that I was starting to show signs of dementia and that they had no choice but to manage my assets for me. She wrote in a way that made it easy to identify me. Because Brian was somewhat famous, my actions were considered unbecoming of his wife. My social media was flooded with negative comments. I started receiving calls from relatives criticizing me. Furthermore, neighbors who used to greet me with a smile started ignoring me or gossiping behind my back. At the local supermarket, even the staff I knew acted coldly towards me. I rapidly felt ostracized by the people around me. I was being treated as a terrible mother-in-law by my relatives and society. I blamed myself more and more. I couldn't clear up the misunderstanding. I became depressed. Due to stress and insomnia, I couldn't even get up during the day. I couldn't eat anything, so I went to the hospital and was admitted for tests. During my hospital stay, I didn't have to worry about Ken and Mary visiting or about what the neighbors thought. I was able to relax. But one night, I was suddenly awakened by someone roughly shaking me. Wake up! Don't think you can just sleep peacefully. We're here to collect the debt. Hurry up and pay. An unfamiliar man was yelling in my face. I was frozen in fear. Your son Ken, right? He owes us $200,000. We're here to collect every last penny. The strange man was apparently a debt collector. Ken's debts had gotten so out of control that he had even turned to loan sharks. A nurse came on her rounds and chased him away. But after that, debt collectors started showing up day and night. Other patients complained that it was frightening. Ken and Mary were called in by the head nurse. Please stop sending debt collectors to the hospital. It's disturbing Mrs. Miller and the other patients, they were told. They seemed remorseful at that moment, but after the head nurse left, they suddenly started arguing. What's going on here? You have loan shark debts? I had no idea. Mary yelled at Ken. It couldn't be helped. I couldn't borrow any more money with my credit cards. And you're committing credit fraud with your clients' accounts, aren't you? That's a crime. How are you going to cover the $300,000? I couldn't believe that Mary was doing such a thing. And you're embezzling money from the company, aren't you? If $400,000 goes missing, you'll be prosecuted for embezzlement. Even Ken. The more I listened, the more my head hurt. Had these two been living such unplanned and irresponsible lives that they had to resort to stealing from their companies? I held my head in my hands. Meanwhile, their argument continued. This all started because you were splurging on luxury goods. If we had lived a normal life, we would have been happy. Oh, please, it's because you're so useless and can't get ahead at work that I had to keep up appearances. I'm buying those brand name items because of you. It's because of your social media posts that I can't get a promotion. I'm on verge of being fired. Who do you think is responsible for us having to get money from loan sharks after you wasted all our money on illegal gambling? The two were getting louder and louder. They were disturbing everyone around them. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to stay in the hospital any longer. I watched them anxiously. Excuse me. We can hear your shouting all the way down the hall. It's disturbing Mrs. Miller and the other patients. Please keep it down. Mr. Wilson appeared like a savior. Behind him was a man I had never seen before. I felt relieved. Mr. Wilson, thank you for coming. Who is this gentleman? I asked about the man behind him. This is Mr. Carter, an attorney who works with me to combat real estate fraud against the elderly. He's my partner, and he usually helps with legal matters. We came today because we have the results of our investigation into your son and daughter-in-law. Then Mr. Carter, the attorney, explained in detail what he had found out about Ken and Mary. He had gathered evidence of Ken's fraudulent transactions at work, Mary's credit card fraud involving her clients, security camera footage of them creating the forged contract, and records of their criminal activities through emails and social media. It was evidence that amateurs like us could never have gathered. He had compiled it all in a format that could be submitted as evidence to the police. We will take this evidence to the police. To prevent them from continuing their criminal activities, they need to face the consequences of their actions, Mr. Wilson said, gazing at Ken and Mary. I thought they would finally admit their guilt and apologize. But then, I'll tell you everything, Mr. Carter. Actually, this mother and son tricked me and threatened me into demanding money and committing fraud. So I had no choice. That evidence is all true. Please use it to arrest this mother and son. Suddenly, Mary got on her knees and tried to pin the blame on me and Ken. Shut up. Don't talk nonsense. I'm divorcing you, you con artist. I'll sue you. Ken yelled at Mary. I couldn't take it anymore. Enough, both of you. Report and atone for your crimes, I said desperately. I recorded all of this conversation as well. It seems that you two are not remorseful enough. You need to go to the police station and reflect on the crimes you've committed. The two hung their heads and left. Afterwards, Ken was fired and arrested for embezzlement. Mary was also arrested for fraud. The test results showed that I had no medical problems. After the two were arrested, I felt much better. I was able to sleep well and my health improved. I was able to return to the house in Beverly Hills thanks to Mr. Brown, who kindly let me rent the house. Tending to my garden, my solace, was now possible every day, which was a great relief. I tried to restore the garden to its former glory by hiring professionals, but it's just not the same. So, Mrs. Miller, I'd like to ask for your help in bringing it back to life. He asked me to help. I had been feeling listless in the apartment I rented by myself, and I was eager to get back to gardening. So I gratefully accepted his offer. When Mrs. Taylor heard that I was back, she was overjoyed. We held hands and smiled at each other. I gradually reconnected with the neighbors, and life began to return to normal. One difference was that thanks to Mr. Wilson's introduction, I started attending a seniors club where I could share tea and conversation. I shared my experiences to help and support others with similar problems. It was a meaningful experience. Ken and Mary later divorced. They were both being chased by debt collectors. Mary apparently tried to get help from her parents, but she had been acting arrogantly towards them even before she got into debt, putting money above all else. As a result, they refused to help her, leaving her to deal with the debt on her own. I was truly glad that I was able to protect the precious house Brian had left me. It also taught me the importance of valuing the people around you and having a strong will, even as you age. With a new purpose in life, I began a more fulfilling journey.